The Portuguese Empire began its rise with Vasco da Gama's arrival in India in 1498, a moment that shifted global power forever. While other European kingdoms were still exploring coastlines, Portugal carved a sea path around Africa and opened a direct trade route to the riches of Asia. Within decades, small fleets flying the Cross of Christ were enforcing tolls on the Indian Ocean and planting fortresses in Goa, Malacca, and Mozambique. The secret was speed, firepower, and audacity. They didn't need vast armies, just enough ships and cannons to control trade choke points. Lisbon transformed almost overnight into the nerve center of global commerce. Spices from the east, gold from Africa, and sugar from Brazil flowed into Portuguese ports, enriching a country barely the size of Maine. For over a century, Portugal reigned as a pioneer in colonialism, building a maritime empire stretching from Brazil to Japan. But the empire that rose with sails and gunpowder began to weaken as rivals caught up. Spain, the Netherlands, and England chipped away at Portuguese outposts. By the 17th century, the Dutch had taken over most of the Asian spice trade. Portugal's long union with Spain from 1580 to 1640 had left its empire overstretched and vulnerable. Even after regaining independence, Portugal struggled to hold its far-flung colonies. Still, Brazil remained a jewel, until 1822, when it declared itself an empire and broke away. The final blows came in the 20th century. After a military coup at home in 1974, Portugal rapidly let go of its last colonies, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and East Timor, by 1975. What had begun with a single daring voyage across uncharted waters ended in quiet retreat, leaving behind a linguistic and cultural legacy that still connects continents but no longer commands them.
The Spanish Empire surged into dominance with the conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1521, when Hernán Cortés marched into Tenochtitlan and dismantled one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. Fueled by gold, silver, and the blessing of the Catholic Church, Spain unleashed a campaign of global expansion. Within decades, its territory stretched from the Andes to the Philippines. The New World became the engine of imperial wealth as galleons ferried immense cargoes of precious metals to Seville. Spain's military might and religious fervor made it the global superpower of the 16th century. The Habsburg monarchs, especially Charles V and Philip II, ruled not just Spain, but large parts of Europe and beyond. Their vision of a united Catholic empire under one crown shaped European politics and colonial conquest alike. With missions and muskets, Spain reshaped entire continents and became the face of European imperialism. But supremacy proved fragile. In 1588, the failure of the Spanish Armada marked the beginning of a long, uneven decline. Wars with England, the Dutch revolt, and endless European entanglements drained the royal treasury. The treasure ships kept coming, but the empire's economy hollowed out under the weight of inflation and dependence on foreign loans. The Bourbon reforms in the 18th century tried to tighten control, but discontent was already spreading in the colonies. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, chaos opened the floodgates of revolution. Over the next century, one by one, Spain's colonies fought for and gained independence. By the time Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States in 1898, the empire that once claimed half the globe had collapsed into a shadow of its former self. Its legacy, architectural, linguistic, and cultural, remains vast, but its imperial ambitions ended in isolation and irrelevance.
The Holy Roman Empire took shape when Otto I was crowned emperor in 962, reviving the idea of a Western Roman legacy under a Germanic king. Unlike centralized monarchies, this empire functioned more like a confederation of semi-autonomous duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, all nominally under the rule of the emperor. It was less a state than a medieval puzzle, a political entity defined by shifting alliances, religious authority, and dynastic ambition. The emperors struggled to control both their vassals and the papacy, leading to centuries of tension between church and state. Yet, despite the constant internal friction, the empire endured. During the height of its influence under rulers like Frederick Barbarossa and Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire spanned much of Central Europe and played a key role in continental power struggles. For centuries, it served as a stage for both crusades and councils, coronations and revolts. But the same complexity that gave it flexibility also sowed its undoing. The Reformation tore into the religious fabric of the empire, igniting the devastating 30 Years' War, which left the region fractured and depopulated. While the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended that war, it also affirmed the autonomy of the empire's many states, weakening the emperor's authority even further. By the 18th century, the title of Holy Roman Emperor had become more symbolic than sovereign. When Napoleon's forces swept through Europe in the early 1800s, the old imperial order couldn't survive. In 1806, under pressure from France, Emperor Francis II dissolved the empire entirely. After nearly a millennium, the Holy Roman Empire vanished, not with a dramatic final battle, but with a bureaucratic resignation. It left behind a tangle of borders, traditions, and political ideas that would echo in Central Europe for generations, long after the crown was put away.
The Dutch Empire rose not through conquests of vast territory, but by building a global trading web with ruthless efficiency. Its ascent began in the early 17th century when the Dutch East India Company seized the Portuguese port of Malacca in 1641 and began dominating the lucrative spice trade. The Dutch weren't interested in converting populations or ruling inland kingdoms. They wanted trade routes, strategic ports, and profitable monopolies. From Batavia and Java to the Cape of Good Hope, they planted fortified outposts that functioned more like businesses than colonial governments. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange flourished, and the Netherlands became one of the wealthiest and most urbanized countries in Europe. In the Caribbean and South America, they established plantations, and in New Amsterdam, now New York, they laid the groundwork for future power centers. Despite their small size, the Dutch punched far above their weight by mastering finance, shipping, and diplomacy. But the empire that rose from merchant ambition eventually ran into stronger imperial rivals. In Asia, competition with the British turned deadly. The Dutch clung to the East Indies, but they were outpaced by the broader territorial ambitions of the British Raj. Their footholds in India faded. Their control of the Cape Colony ended in 1806 when the British seized it during the Napoleonic Wars. Meanwhile, their holdings in the Americas were chipped away throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Yet, remarkably, the Dutch managed to retain control over Indonesia into the 20th century. The real unraveling came after World War II. Indonesian nationalists, hardened by years of Japanese occupation and inspired by anti-colonial movements, declared independence in 1945. The Netherlands resisted, but after years of conflict and growing international pressure, they recognized Indonesian independence in 1949. The Dutch flag, lowered for the last time in Jakarta, marked not only the end of their empire, but the final chapter of an era when trade alone could build global dominance.
The Swedish Empire surged onto the European stage with its stunning victory at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631 during the chaos of the 30 Years' War. Led by King Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden transformed from a chilly northern kingdom into a dominant military power, armed with cutting-edge tactics and a fiercely disciplined army. At Breitenfeld, the Swedish forces outmaneuvered the Catholic League in a battle that stunned Europe. For a time, Sweden dictated the course of the war, and Gustavus earned a reputation as one of the most brilliant generals of his age. The empire quickly expanded, taking control of territories along the Baltic Sea, including parts of modern-day Finland, Estonia, Latvia, northern Germany, and even a foothold in Poland. The Baltic, once dominated by Denmark and local powers, became known as a Swedish lake. Through savvy military campaigns and strategic marriages, Sweden climbed to the top ranks of European power. But this imperial flame burned bright and fast. The turning point came in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava, a disastrous campaign that exposed the limits of Sweden's reach. Charles XII, the warrior king who had led Sweden to further victories, marched deep into Russia with hopes of toppling Peter the Great. But the Swedish army was stretched thin and unprepared for Russia's brutal winter and scorched earth tactics. At Poltava, Charles was defeated decisively, and the dream of Swedish dominance shattered. The once feared Swedish army was decimated, and Charles himself fled into exile. The Great Northern War dragged on for years, but the loss at Poltava signaled the beginning of the end. Over the following decades, Sweden lost most of its overseas territories and gradually reverted to being a regional power. Though its empire faded, Sweden's short-lived reign left an outsized mark on early modern Europe, proof that even small nations, when expertly led, can bend history to their will.
The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth rose in 1569 with the signing of the Union of Lublin, creating one of the largest and most unusual political entities in Europe. Rather than being forged by conquest, it was a voluntary merger between the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, forming a sprawling dual monarchy that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Its system was unique. A powerful nobility elected the king, who ruled alongside a parliament known as the Sejm. This aristocratic democracy produced moments of remarkable tolerance, religious freedom, and cultural flourishing. Warsaw and Krakow buzzed with intellectual life, while cities like Vilnius and Lviv became crossroads of Eastern and Western traditions. The Commonwealth served as a buffer between Western Europe and rising Eastern powers, fighting off invasions from the Ottomans, Tatars, and Russians. At its height in the 17th century, it was not just a vast kingdom, it was a civilization unto itself. But its greatest innovation, noble liberty, also sowed the seeds of decline. The Liberum Veto allowed any single noble in the Sejm to block legislation, paralyzing reform. Over time, powerful neighbors grew stronger while the Commonwealth became increasingly fragmented and vulnerable. By the 18th century, it had become a pawn in the power plays of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Internal reforms came too late. In 3 partitions between 1772 and 1795, those rival empires carved up the entire territory, erasing Poland from the map. No dramatic fall in battle marked the end, just signatures on diplomatic papers and foreign armies marching in. For over a century, there would be no Polish state, though the idea of Polish identity survived in exile, uprisings, and culture. The Commonwealth's rise had been a beacon of pluralism in an age of absolutism, its fall a cautionary tale of what happens when political freedom lacks the structure to defend itself.
The French colonial empire rose in 2 great waves, and together they made France one of the largest imperial powers in history. The first wave began in the 17th century, when traders, missionaries, and soldiers established footholds in Canada, the Caribbean, West Africa, and parts of India. Quebec, Saint-Domingue, Pondicherry, these names marked a far-flung web of commerce built on furs, sugar, and maritime reach. Yet this early empire was fragile. Defeat in the 7 Years' War stripped France of most of its North American and Indian territories in 1763, dealing a blow so severe that many thought French overseas ambition had ended. Instead, it reset. Napoleon briefly rebuilt influence in Europe, but the true second wave came later, in the 19th century, when industrial power, national prestige, and rivalry with Britain pushed France back overseas. That resurgence took shape under monarchs and republics alike. Algeria, invaded in 1830, became the cornerstone, a settler colony unlike any other in the French overseas world. From North Africa, the empire expanded into West and Central Africa, carving out massive territories that would later form French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. In Asia, naval expeditions and diplomacy opened the way into mainland Southeast Asia. By the 1860s, France had secured Saigon, then pressed inland to create French Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and eventually Laos, binding river systems, plantation economies, and colonial administration into a single imperial unit. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent in the early 20th century, stretching from Dakar to Damascus, from Noumea to Hanoi. French language, law, bureaucracy, and education systems followed, reshaping societies while extracting labor and resources to fuel the metropole. 2 world wars cracked that structure. Colonial troops fought and bled for France, yet calls for self-rule grew louder after 1918 and became unstoppable after 1945. The loss of Indochina after the First Indochina War, capped by the 1954 defeat at Dien Bien Phu, was a turning point. Worse followed in North Africa, the brutal, polarizing Algerian War from 1954 to 1962 tore France apart politically and socially. When Algeria finally gained independence in 1962, the empire's emotional center was gone. Over the next decade, most African colonies negotiated independence, many retaining French as an administrative language, but not French authority. What remains today, overseas departments like Martinique, Réunion, and French Guiana, are threads of continuity, not an empire. France's global project rose, fractured, and transformed, leaving behind a linguistic and cultural sphere that outlived formal rule.
The Ottoman Empire began its European expansion with the capture of Adrianople, modern Edirne, in 1361, but it was the fall of Constantinople in 1453 that cemented its place as a true imperial power. Led by Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottomans breached the great walls of the Byzantine capital, bringing an end to the Eastern Roman Empire and transforming Istanbul into a thriving imperial seat. From there, the Ottomans pushed deep into Europe. Over the next 2 centuries, they controlled large parts of the Balkans, Hungary, and even laid siege to Vienna. The Janissary Corps, elite infantry trained from childhood, became synonymous with Ottoman might, and sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent brought administration, law, and culture alongside conquest. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was the dominant force in southeastern Europe, with a multicultural domain stretching from Algiers to Baghdad, from Cairo to Budapest. But by the 18th century, the empire's grip on Europe began to loosen. Internal corruption, military stagnation, and the rise of national identities among subject peoples all contributed to decline. While reforms attempted to modernize the state, they couldn't fully reverse centuries of institutional inertia. The 19th century brought repeated losses. Serbia, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria all broke away, often with the backing of Russia or the Western powers. The empire's collapse in Europe accelerated after the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913. A coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, launched a surprise assault and overwhelmed Ottoman forces in a matter of weeks. The defeats were humiliating. The Ottomans lost almost all of their remaining European territory, clinging only to a small strip around Istanbul. The Balkan Wars weren't just a military loss. They shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility in Europe. The empire, once feared in Vienna and Venice, now appeared brittle and outdated. Within a year, the Ottomans joined World War I in a desperate gamble to restore their position. But the war only hastened the end. Following their defeat in 1918, the empire was carved up, and in 1922, the Sultanate was formally abolished. From its ashes rose the modern Republic of Turkey, a nation-state that decisively turned its back on imperial legacy. The Ottomans had ruled parts of Europe for nearly 6 centuries. Their departure was not just the end of an empire, but the final retreat of a medieval system in the face of modern nationalism and geopolitics.
The Habsburg Empire didn't emerge through a single act of conquest, but through marriages, diplomacy, and inheritance. Let others wage war, the saying went, but you, happy Austria, marry. By the 16th century, the Habsburgs controlled vast lands across Europe, from Spain and the Netherlands to Bohemia, Hungary, and Austria itself. After the Spanish branch went its own way, the Austrian Habsburgs focused on Central Europe, eventually evolving into the Austrian Empire in 1804. It became a bastion of conservatism, Roman Catholic authority, and dynastic rule, holding together a mosaic of nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Italians, Poles, Ukrainians, and others. Vienna grew into a political and cultural capital, but the empire's strength always depended on balancing internal diversity with imperial centralism, a balancing act that grew harder with time. Napoleon's rise forced the Habsburgs to adapt. In 1806, Holy Roman Emperor Francis II dissolved that ancient title and crowned himself Emperor of Austria, creating a centralized monarchy better suited for the new age. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 restored Austria's dominance in European politics, but the seeds of decay had already been planted. Nationalism swept through Europe in the 19th century, and in 1848 the empire exploded with revolutions. Though these uprisings were suppressed, they exposed the fragility of an empire trying to suppress dozens of identities under one banner. The 1867 compromise that created Austria-Hungary temporarily stabilized the state, granting Hungary near equal status, but also institutionalizing ethnic division. The dual monarchy became a complex bureaucracy, always teetering on the edge of competing demands. It was efficient in some ways, backward in others, and always a step behind faster-moving rivals like Germany or Britain. The empire's fate was sealed in 1914 when the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo ignited World War I. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, setting off a chain reaction of alliances and global conflict. The war exposed the military and political weakness of the Habsburg realm. By 1918, exhausted and fractured, the empire collapsed under the weight of defeat, economic ruin, and nationalist movements. New states, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and others, emerged from its ruins. Emperor Karl I abdicated, ending over 6 centuries of Habsburg rule. The empire had once been Europe's conservative heart, defending old values in an age of change. But in the end, it could not withstand the pressures of modernity, nor satisfy the people it ruled.
The British Empire began as a patchwork of colonies and trading posts, but by the 19th century, it had become the largest empire in history. Its rise was driven by maritime prowess, commercial ambition, and strategic timing. From the settlement of Jamestown in 1607 to the conquest of Bengal after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Britain steadily expanded its influence overseas. The defeat of France in the 7 Years' War handed Britain dominance in North America and India. Even the loss of the 13 colonies in the American Revolution didn't halt its ascent. If anything, it shifted Britain's focus further east and south. By the mid-1800s, the empire stretched across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, giving rise to the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire." Trade, backed by naval supremacy, was the empire's lifeblood. Tea from China, cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and later, oil from the Middle East. Yet the empire was never just about goods. It came with administrators, missionaries, railways, schools, and courts, an entire system exported to vastly different cultures. In India, the British Raj ruled over hundreds of millions, sometimes through alliances with local princes, sometimes by force. In Africa, borders were drawn with little regard for ethnic divisions, setting the stage for future instability. Britain justified its control through a belief in civilizing missions and racial hierarchy, but resistance was constant, from the Zulu Wars to the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The 20th century, marked by 2 world wars, strained Britain's resources and shook its confidence. Colonized peoples had fought and died for the empire, and after 1945, calls for self-rule became impossible to ignore.
India, the empire's crown jewel, gained independence in 1947, followed by a wave of decolonization across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Some transitions were peaceful. Others, like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, were violent and traumatic. By the 1970s, the British Empire had all but dissolved. What remained was the Commonwealth, a loose association of former colonies, and a Britain redefined by immigration, post-imperial reflection, and global repositioning. The empire's legacy is immense. English is now a global language, and institutions from parliamentary democracy to legal systems bear its imprint. But its collapse also left deep scars and unresolved histories. Once the most powerful force on Earth, the British Empire faded not with a single defeat, but through a long, uneven retreat, driven by changing values, rising nationalisms, and the growing costs of global control.
The German Empire was born out of blood and iron. In 1871, following victory in the Franco-Prussian War, Otto von Bismarck unified dozens of fragmented German states under Prussian leadership and declared the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, an act as symbolic as it was provocative. This newly forged empire was a titan, industrialized, militarized, and determined to claim its place among Europe's great powers. Berlin rapidly became the center of a modern nation-state defined by scientific innovation, railroads, steel production, and a rising middle class. Germany's late entry into colonial competition spurred a scramble to secure overseas possessions. While its holdings in Africa and the Pacific were smaller than Britain or France, the empire's ambitions signaled that it wanted more than just a seat at the table. It wanted to lead. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, the empire grew more assertive and erratic. Bismarck had tried to maintain peace through a web of alliances, but Wilhelm dismissed him in 1890 and pursued a more aggressive foreign policy. Naval expansion, saber-rattling diplomacy, and involvement in crises from Morocco to the Balkans unnerved the other great powers. Germany's rapid rise upset the balance of Europe, and when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in 1914, Germany backed Austria-Hungary in a conflict that spiraled into World War I. The empire's well-trained army fought on multiple fronts, but as the war dragged on, the strain proved unbearable. Food shortages, internal unrest, and mounting casualties eroded public support. The once confident empire found itself blockaded, battered, and isolated. In November 1918, as revolution spread and soldiers mutinied, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The German Empire collapsed, and the Weimar Republic was proclaimed. The Treaty of Versailles that followed stripped Germany of its colonies, imposed severe territorial losses, and placed the blame for the war squarely on its shoulders. While Germany would remain a powerful country, its first experiment with unified imperial power had ended in catastrophe. The empire's fall marked not just a military defeat, but the implosion of a society torn between modern ambitions and imperial overreach. Its legacy would shape the turbulent years that followed and lay the groundwork for even greater upheavals to come.
The Soviet Union didn't rise through traditional conquest, but from the wreckage of empire and revolution. In 1917, the Russian Empire crumbled amid war, famine, and popular revolt. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power and founded a new socialist state built on Marxist ideology and centralized authority. After a brutal civil war and years of restructuring, the Soviet Union was officially formed in 1922, a federation of republics bound by Communist Party rule. Unlike other empires, it didn't claim colonies overseas, but instead absorbed and dominated its neighbors through ideology, surveillance, and military control. From Ukraine and the Baltics to Central Asia and the Caucasus, vast populations came under Moscow's command. Under Joseph Stalin, the USSR transformed into an industrial powerhouse through forced collectivization and rapid modernization, though at the cost of millions of lives lost to purges, famines, and labor camps. By the time World War II broke out, the Soviet Union was a fearsome military and political force. After repelling the Nazi invasion at tremendous cost, particularly in battles like Stalingrad, the USSR emerged from the war as one of two global superpowers. Eastern Europe, liberated by the Red Army, soon fell under Soviet influence, forming the Eastern Bloc behind what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain. The Cold War followed, a decades-long standoff with the United States, fought not with direct combat, but with nuclear threats, espionage, proxy wars, and ideological battles across the globe. The Soviets launched the first satellite, sent the first human into space, and wielded immense cultural and political influence. But beneath the surface, cracks deepened. Economic inefficiency, lack of innovation, and rising nationalism within the republics steadily weakened the structure. By the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to reform the stagnant system with policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. But instead of rejuvenating the Soviet Union, these policies unleashed long-suppressed grievances. Republics declared independence, the economy spiraled, and political authority unraveled. In 1991, after a failed coup attempt and rising unrest, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 15 republics emerged from its collapse, with Russia as the successor state. The Soviet Union had once presented itself as the future of global society, scientific, collective, and just, but it ended as a cautionary tale, a superstate so rigid and centralized that it could not adapt to the world it helped shape. Its fall wasn't just a conclusion of a political project, it marked the end of an era that had defined the 20th century.